Ever get that feeling? Like Europe, yeah, it's moving forward, things are happening, but maybe we could be doing even better.
Something's holding us back.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Today, we're going deep on this idea of Europe's productivity, specifically how we stack up against the US.
And it's not just about, you know, bragging rights.
Right. It's way more than that. It's about our ability to innovate, to grow our economies, to feel good about the future right here in Europe.
It absolutely impacts every single one of us. Less productivity per hour is like, imagine trying to win a race, but you're stuck in second gear.
Ooh, I like that analogy. We might eventually get there, but
Yeah,
it'll
yeah.
be a slog, and we'll miss out on the thrill of really accelerating.
Precisely. And what's really cool about this deep dive is that we're not just speculating, we're bringing in some serious research firepower from the IMF.
Oh, yeah, they went in deep, analyzing companies, the whole shebang, to figure out what's behind this productivity gap.
Firm-level insights, super valuable.
And so our mission, just for you listening, is to break this down. What can Europe as a whole do? What about individual countries?
And businesses themselves, what can they do differently?
Even us, regular citizens, what role do we have in all this? Can we actually boost Europe's productivity and, make things better for everyone?
It's all connected. So let's unpack this IMF research and see what they found.
Sounds good to me. All right, first things first, we got to set the stage. This productivity gap, it's not a new phenomenon, right?
Nope, not at all.
Hmm.
For a while, Europe was actually closing the gap with the US. We were making good progress.
Catching up, things were looking good.
But then, around the mid-90s, the trend reversed. The gap started widening again.
And after COVID, things haven't really improved.
No, unfortunately.
Now, here's the thing that jumped out at me. It's not like we Europeans decided to, collectively slack off, work fewer hours, take longer lunches.
Right, it's not about laziness or anything like that. The data's clear.
Yeah, our hourly labor productivity, meaning how much we actually produce per hour worked, it's lower than in the US. It's not that we're not working, it's that we're not getting as much done in each of those hours.
And the research points to what they call lower total factor productivity.
Okay, now I'm going to need you to break that down a bit. Total factor. What was it again?
Total factor productivity. Think of it like baking a cake,
Yeah.
right? It's not just about having enough flour and eggs. It's about how well you combine those ingredients.
Uh-huh, the technique, the skill of the baker.
Exactly. So total factor productivity is like the recipe for an entire economy. It's not just about labor and capital, the inputs,
Yeah.
but how efficiently they're used, how innovations improve the process.
So we're not lacking the ingredients, we're not as good at putting them all together.
That's part of the puzzle.
Well-
And here's where it gets even more intriguing. This productivity slowdown in Europe, it happened even though we had some pretty big market reforms back in the 90s and early 2000s.
You'd think those reforms would have given productivity a boost, right?
You'd assume so, wouldn't you? But the numbers tell a different story. So the question is, why? Why are we still lacking?
Big question. And this is where the IMF research gets super interesting. They zoomed in on companies comparing European firms to their US counterparts.
They found some pretty clear patterns, what they call stylized facts.
Stylized facts, I like that. Okay, let's start with the big fish. Those publicly listed companies, often the leaders in their industries. What's the story there?
Well, it turns out that Europe's top firms, both tech and non-tech, they're not innovating or growing as much as similar firms in the US. And the difference is really stark when you look specifically at tech.
Tech, yeah, that's a hot topic these days.
It is. So over the last 2 decades, the total productivity of listed tech firms in the US jumped by a whopping 40%.
40%, that's huge.
Huge. And in Europe, nada. Zero overall gain in productivity for those same kinds of tech companies.
So all those amazing innovations, those efficiency boosts we see coming from US tech giants, we're not matching that in Europe.
Not at the same scale, no. Think about it. Mentioned a specific example of a US tech innovation and its impact. We haven't seen a comparable European equivalent with that kind of widespread effect.
Makes you think, right. And it seems like a big part of it is how much companies are investing in the future.
Yeah, the research shows that European tech firms are putting way less of their earnings into R&D compared to their US rivals. And it's reflected in the number of patents they're filing, too.
So the engine of innovation, it's not running at full power in Europe's leading companies. Why do you think that is?
Well, there are a few possible explanations.
Yeah.
But let's move on to the second key trend the IMF found. This one's about young, fast-growing companies, those startups that can really shake things up.
The disruptors.
Exactly, sometimes called gazelles. And the finding here is that these European gazelles, They're not as disruptive, they're not having the same impact on job creation as similar firms in the US.
Less bang for our buck, so to speak.
It's not that we have fewer startups overall. The rate of new business creation is pretty similar to the US, though it does vary between EU countries,
Yeah, some countries are more entrepreneurial than others.
for sure. But the key difference is the quality of those startups. When you look at the higher quality entrants, those that aren't just tiny micro businesses,
Mhm.
the US has way more of those.
More potential for growth and impact.
Exactly. And get this, those top-performing young U.S. firms, they account for 6 times the number of jobs compared to their European counterparts. 6 times. That's a huge difference in their economic footprint.
Wow, okay, that's significant. And what about the companies that reach the top of the stock market?
Well, the research found that the companies listed on European stock exchanges, they tend to be older than their U.S. equivalents.
So fewer of those brand new, super innovative companies breaking through.
That's what the data suggests.
Interesting. Okay, on to trend number 3. You mentioned Europe having a lack of business dynamism. What exactly does that mean?
It's not just about the shortage of high-growth startups. It's also that we don't see as much of that up-and-out movement. Fewer unsuccessful companies are closing down.
So more companies sticking around, even if they're not doing so well.
Yeah. And that means we end up with a higher proportion of smaller, more mature businesses that aren't really growing. Think of it like, imagine a forest where the old trees never really die off. It gets crowded, and it's harder for new saplings to get the sunlight they need to thrive.
Uh-huh, I get it. So less room for new, innovative companies to really take root and grow.
Precisely. And the research backs this up. The range of growth rates among European firms is narrower. The average size of a company doesn't increase as much over its lifetime compared to the U.S., and we have a much bigger percentage of people working in those micro firms.
So the European business landscape is, in a way, less dynamic.
That's the picture that emerges from the research. And these 3 trends, they're likely interconnected. Think about it. If you have fewer groundbreaking new companies, that reduces the competitive pressure on those established leading firms. They might innovate less.
Complacency sets in.
Maybe. And conversely, if Europe's big companies are struggling to compete globally, that might discourage ambitious startups. Why even try to enter those markets? It can create a kind of vicious cycle impacting the overall productivity of the European economy.
So we've identified where Europe seems to be lagging behind. Now, let's get to the why. Why are our leading firms struggling to keep up with their American counterparts?
The IMF research points to 2 key reasons. The first one is the idea of limited effective market size.
Okay, explain that one.
Sure. So while the EU and the US have roughly the same overall economic size, when you consider purchasing power, the EU market is way more fragmented.
Lots of different countries, different regulations, different languages.
Exactly. So European companies end up operating in what are effectively smaller markets compared to the unified market in the US.
Less opportunity to expand to reach more customers.
That's a big part of it. And the amount of trade between EU countries, it's much lower than trade between US states. European companies don't benefit as much from economies of scale.
Like, imagine a small local shop versus a giant supermarket chain. The supermarket can offer lower prices because they buy and sell in such large quantities.
Exactly. A unified market would allow European businesses to act more like that big supermarket chain.
Interesting. And the research actually uses Europe's own history as an example of how beneficial a larger market can be.
Yeah, they looked at previous EU expansions, and those actually helped poorer countries catch up economically, boosting their productivity.
Because they suddenly had access to this much larger market.
Right. And at the company level, joining the EU led to more sales, higher productivity, especially for bigger firms. So the principle holds true. A larger market drives productivity.
So the question is, how big are the remaining obstacles to trade within the EU today?
Right. And the research gets pretty specific here. One way they measured this was by comparing how much international trade happens within the EU versus domestic trade within each country.
So comparing cross-border trade to purely internal trade.
Yeah. And while cross-border trade within the EU has been increasing, meaning barriers are coming down, it's still significantly less than what you see within the US.
So those barriers, they're still having a real impact.
Absolutely. They even used a more complex analysis called a gravity model, which takes into account various factors that influence trade. It's like trying to estimate the equivalent of a tariff or tax on trade within the EU.
A hidden cost of doing business across borders.
You got it. And their findings suggest that in 2020, these hidden costs were still pretty substantial, especially for services.
Services, yeah, that's a huge part of the modern economy.
Absolutely. So for goods, the average extra cost was around 44%.
Okay, that's already a lot.
But for services, it was over 110%. It's like saying a European company trying to sell its services in another EU country faces costs that are more than double what they'd face domestically.
That's crazy. No wonder it's holding us back.
Yeah, even though we don't have literal tariffs between EU countries, these hidden costs act like a tax on trade. They make it harder and more expensive for European businesses to operate across borders. And even for goods, while progress has been made, those barriers still vary quite a bit depending on the industry.
So some sectors are more affected than others.
Right. For example, electrical machinery and telecoms have seen bigger reductions in these trade costs than, say, cars or electronics.
It's a reminder that the idea of a truly unified single market in Europe, it's not fully realized yet, especially for services.
And the IMF research even drew a connection between these barriers and potential productivity gains. They looked at the impact of the trade agreement between the U.S. and Canada.
NAFTA, or whatever it's called now.
Yeah, and their findings suggest that further reducing these internal EU trade barriers could lead to a significant boost in Europe's overall productivity.
Okay, so that's a big takeaway. We need to keep pushing for a truly unified single market. What about the second reason for Europe's lagging firms? You mentioned something about equity financing.
Right. The second big factor is that European firms rely less on equity financing compared to their U.S. counterparts.
Equity financing meaning raising money by selling shares, right?
Exactly. European companies tend to rely more on borrowing money, taking on debt. But U.S. firms, especially publicly traded ones, they raise significantly more money through equity.
And why does that matter for productivity?
Well, equity financing is generally considered more suitable for riskier investments, like research and development. Because with equity, you don't have that immediate pressure to pay back the money with interest, like you do with a loan.
So it gives companies more breathing room to invest in long-term uncertain projects.
Precisely. And the research suggests that this difference in financing might be contributing to a less stable pattern of intangible investments in Europe. Things like R&D, more ups and downs compared to the U.S.
Stop and go instead of steady progress.
Exactly. And we see this in the data. Even though European firms might have similar fluctuations in their overall revenues as U.S. firms, their R&D spending tends to be more volatile, bigger changes, more frequently.
So it's harder to maintain that consistent investment that's so crucial for innovation.
That's the idea. This stop-and-go approach can really hinder long-term R&D projects, the kind that are essential for boosting productivity, for creating those new products and services that ultimately benefit everyone.
And how did the researchers measure this difference in access to funding?
They used a metric called the marginal propensity to invest, or MPI. It basically measures how sensitive a company's investments are to temporary changes in their cash flow. And what they found is that European tech firms are much more sensitive than their U.S. counterparts, meaning if a European tech company hits a bit of a rough patch financially, they're much more likely to cut back on crucial investments.
Because they're more reliant on debt, which has those stricter repayment schedules?
Right, they have less financial flexibility. And this vulnerability was really exposed during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. European firms that had more limited access to financing, they drastically reduced their R&D investments compared to similar U.S. firms.
So having stable access to funding, especially through equity, it's like a buffer against those economic shocks. It allows companies to keep investing in the future, even when times are tough.
Exactly. And that ultimately benefits everyone through continued innovation. Okay, so we've covered the challenges faced by Europe's leading companies. Now let's shift gears and focus on those young, high-growth firms, the gazelles.
The ones we need more of.
Definitely. So as we mentioned earlier, Europe doesn't have as many of these rapidly expanding young companies as we'd like. Their numbers have picked up a bit recently, but they're still below pre-2008 levels.
And their presence in tech, while growing, is still pretty limited.
It is. Now, the research on this topic mainly focuses on what influences the formation of these gazelles within Europe, because unfortunately, there isn't readily available data on non-listed U.S. companies to make a direct comparison.
So we're looking at what helps or hinders the birth of these gazelles within Europe itself.
Exactly. And one key area they looked at is demographics. The findings suggest that an aging population, which is a bigger challenge in Europe than in the US, can actually have a negative impact on the creation of these gazelle companies.
Because older people are less likely to start businesses.
Well, it's more nuanced than that. It might be about risk aversion, or maybe older people have more established careers and are less likely to take the leap into entrepreneurship.
Interesting. And what about the opposite? A younger, more dynamic workforce?
That's where things get positive. The research found a strong link between gazelle formation and the presence of highly skilled young workers, including immigrants. It makes sense. You need that fresh talent, those new ideas to drive innovation.
So attracting and retaining young talent is crucial for boosting Europe's startup scene.
Absolutely. And it's something Europe needs to focus on, given its demographic challenges.
Makes sense. Now, we talked about financing being an issue for established firms. What about these young gazelles?
Well, underfinancing is a major hurdle for them too. They often struggle to secure the capital they need to scale up. And the research indicates that these gazelles actually have a higher potential return on investment compared to larger, more established companies.
So they offer a better bang for the buck, but they still can't get the funding they need.
It's a bit of a paradox. It suggests that there's a mismatch between their potential and investors' willingness to back them.
And why do you think that is?
There are several factors. One is that these gazelle companies, especially those heavily reliant on intangible assets like software or intellectual property, they face higher borrowing costs than larger, more established firms.
Because intangible assets are harder to use as collateral for loan.
Exactly. Lenders are more comfortable with tangible assets, like factories or real estate.
Makes sense. And then, of course, there's the whole venture capital scene.
Right. Venture capital, or VC, is super important for these high-growth startups.
Yeah.
It's not just about the money. It's about the expertise, the connections that VC firms bring to the table. And the research clearly shows that the amount of VC investment in the EU is significantly lower than in the US. Plus, it's concentrated in just a handful of European countries.
So fewer resources and less even distribution of those resources.
That's the issue. And the research even provides firm-level evidence that European companies that do manage to secure VC funding experience a substantial increase in their intangible assets and overall productivity.
So VC really can make a difference.
It can be a game changer for these young, innovative companies. All right, so we've laid out some of the key challenges. Now let's get to the solutions. What can we actually do to address these issues and give Europe's productivity a much-needed boost?
Yeah, let's get practical.
The IMF research offers a pretty comprehensive roadmap. They outline potential actions from 4 key perspectives: the European Union, individual member countries, businesses based in Europe, and all of us as European citizens.
4 angles of attack. Let's start with the EU. What can they do?
The most prominent recommendation is to double down on the single market. We need to actively dismantle those remaining barriers to trade within the EU.
We were just talking about those hidden costs, those barriers to services.
Exactly. So this means improving infrastructure at borders, opening up protected sectors, making it easier to trade services across borders, and harmonizing regulations across all member states.
Creating a truly level playing field for businesses across Europe.
Right. This would allow companies to operate more easily across the entire EU, tap into a larger customer base, and benefit from those economies of scale we were talking about, ultimately boosting their productivity.
It makes sense. Unleash the power of the single market. The research also emphasized the Capital Markets Union, right? Making it easier for companies to access funding.
Yes, that's essential. Increasing the availability of equity financing for businesses of all sizes, from those tiny startups to the established players. This could involve reassessing the regulations for insurance companies, maybe even working towards greater consistency in how capital markets are overseen across the EU.
So harmonizing things a bit more.
Yeah, reducing complexity.
Yeah.
The goal is to make it easier for companies to raise the funds they need to invest and grow. And then, when it comes to those young, high-growth companies specifically, making it easier for venture capital to flourish is crucial.
More VC money flowing into Europe.
That's the idea. And there are several ways to do this. We could harmonize regulations around VC funds to attract more investment, have the European Investment Fund play a more active role in catalyzing private investment. Maybe even consider a pan-European framework for company law to reduce the complexities of operating across different member states.
So making it easier for VC firms to operate across borders. And what about talent? You mentioned that earlier.
Right. Talent mobility is super important. We need to make it easier for skilled people to move and work across the EU. This could involve things like improving the portability of pensions, making sure professional qualifications are recognized in all member states.
So someone with a medical license in France can easily practice in Germany, for example.
Exactly. It's about removing those artificial barriers to talent flow. Okay, so that's the EU level. What about individual member countries? What can they do?
Yeah, lots of responsibility there too, I
Yeah,
imagine.
there is. One key area is reducing bureaucracy. Make it easier to start a new business. Less red tape, fewer administrative hurdles.
Streamline things, cut the paperwork.
Precisely. And then there's the labor market. We need regulations that provide security for workers while also giving companies the flexibility to adapt.
That's a tough balance to strike.
It is. But there are good examples out there. The flex security model, for example, which aims to achieve exactly that. Security for workers and flexibility for businesses.
I've heard of that. Sounds promising.
It's definitely worth exploring.
Okay.
And of course, education and skills are crucial. Member countries need to invest in improving their universities, their higher education systems, but also in programs to upskill the existing workforce.
Vocational training, apprenticeships, things like that.
Exactly. And addressing those mismatches between the skills people have and the jobs that are available. And let's not forget about digital infrastructure. Member countries need to invest in the digital backbone that underpins a modern, productive economy.
Broadband, internet, 5G, all that good stuff.
Exactly. We also need to improve insolvency frameworks, make it easier for less productive companies to exit the market gracefully. This allows resources to be reallocated to more promising ventures.
So a bit of creative destruction.
In a sense, yes. It's about allowing those resources to flow to where they can be used most effectively. And finally, tax incentives. Member countries can strengthen tax incentives for research and development, but they need to be targeted at young, innovative companies, not just based on company size. And maybe even consider how to better coordinate these incentives across the EU.
So that R&D investment is encouraged in a way that benefits the entire European economy. Okay, so we've covered the EU and individual member countries. Now, let's zoom in on businesses. What role do they play in all this?
Businesses need to step up too. First, they need to recognize the huge growth opportunities that a deeper single market would offer, and they should actively support efforts to complete it. Lobby their governments, speak out publicly, whatever it takes.
Be advocates for a more unified Europe.
Exactly. They also need to be more open to different financing options. Explore equity and venture capital. Don't just rely on traditional debt financing. And of course, invest in their employees. Training, development, attracting top talent from across Europe and beyond.
Building a skilled and motivated workforce.
Right. And let's not forget about embracing innovation. Investing in R&D to stay competitive on the global stage.
So a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of businesses. And lastly, what about us, the regular citizens of Europe? What's our role in this whole productivity puzzle?
It's about understanding that a more competitive, innovative Europe ultimately benefits everyone. It means supporting policies that foster a dynamic business environment, recognizing the importance of investing in education and skills, both for ourselves and for future generations.
Lifelong learning.
Exactly. And being open to the changes that come with a more innovative, competitive economy.
Change can be scary, but it's often necessary for progress.
Absolutely. So, to sum it all up, this deep dive into the IMF's research has revealed that Europe's productivity challenge is a complex beast. It's about the performance of our leading companies, the dynamism of our startups, and those fundamental factors like market integration and access to financing.
A lot of moving parts.
And there's no silver bullet. Addressing these challenges will require sustained effort on multiple fronts. The EU, individual countries, businesses, and us, the citizens, we all have a role to play.
A collective effort.
It's a long-term project that touches on everything from education and regulation to the whole ecosystem for innovation and entrepreneurship.
So where do we even begin?
Well, a good starting point is doubling down on the single market. Really make it a reality. And that need to be coupled with ambitious reforms at the national level to create a more business-friendly, innovation-driven environment.
Lay the groundwork for success.
Exactly. Now, this brings up a really interesting question for you, our listener. We've talked about so many different areas, from trade barriers to financing to talent. Considering all these interconnected factors, what single action, if implemented boldly and effectively, do you believe could have the biggest impact on Europe's future competitiveness?
If you had a magic wand, what one thing would you change?
What's the domino that, if tipped over, could unleash a cascade of positive change across the entire European economy? It's something to think about.
Definitely food for thought. And that's it for this deep dive into Europe's productivity challenge. Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.